Today I want to talk. Today about the bones of Joseph. They have been bothering me for a long time. Those bones, them dry bones. We will dive straight into the text. So let me start with a quote from Wordsworth, which really ran through as you will see at the end of our podcast, we're left with more questions than any answers. And so he writes in Intimations of Immortality, those obstinate questionings of sense and outward things, fallings from us, vanishings, blank misgivings of a creature with a capital C, moving about in worlds not realized. You know, Wordsworth was part of this this group of 19th century poets with Keats and Byron and Shelley, who had a sense of the sublime, this sense of something intimating something beyond this world, and were able to put it in a way that was really non-theological. Remember, they're fighting in the Enlightenment this heavy Lutheran theology, and that's what left me at the end of this whole study of what we're going to discuss today. And so let's go first into these Bereshit 50:24. Joseph says to his brothers, "I'm about to die." And I am dying, but God will surely take you out. Pakod yifkod, and bring you out of this land that God promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So he's on his deathbed in Parshas Vayechi, and he says to his brother, "I'm dying, but God will take account." Yes, account. Pakod is an accounting. Pakod yifkod. He'll remember. He'll bring you back to the land of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And Adele Berlin, wonderful commentator on the Bible, in this wonderful book called The Women's Commentary, there's two other uses of the word pei kuf dalet, pakod yifkad. Moshe will say it in our parsha that God adjured us to remember, and then God promises Sarah that the angel tells her that pakod, he will remember you. So there are two other uses of that. Let's look at the three times that we talk about the bones of Joseph. And here we have it. Vayishba Yosef es bnei Yisrael, pakod yifkod. Moshe says, he adjures the sons of Israel, saying, when God has taken notice of you, or when he takes an accounting, that's the JPS translation, pakod yifkod elkem eschem va'aleisim es atzmosai mizeh. You should take out my bones from here. Why bones? The question is, if the next verse it says they Vayomos Yosef vayechantu oso. They embalmed him. The purpose of embalming is to maintain the flesh. In ancient Egypt, it was very important that the flesh remain, the heart remain, as you pass through the Styx River into the next world, and they measure the weight of your heart. the weight of your good deeds. So what is it, the bones? That's the first question. Why does it say, take my bones? Take me out, take my body. And now in our parsha, in Beshalach, Vayikach Moshe es atzmos Yosef. Second mention. Moshe took with him the bones of... Why didn't the sons of Joseph take the bones? Why is it left to Moshe Rabbeinu? These are the questions that the Midrash asks. What's it about Moshe Rabbeinu? Let the boys do it. He has 2 sons. Ki hashbeah hishbias b'nei Yisrael. So Moshe is picking up on what Joseph had adjured the B'nai Yisrael, saying, Pakod yifkod Elokim eschem. That same double loshon, you shall surely take notice and take my bones out. So this is the framing narrative. The end of Genesis, the last psukim of Genesis, the introduction to the patriarchs, and the beginning of the exodus from Egypt. They're about to leave, and Moshe remembers, oh my gosh, we got to take Joseph out of here. And it frames the end of the Exodus when they finally come to Eretz Yisrael. What happens? In the end of Joshua, Ves Atzmos Yosef Asher He'elu B'nei Yisrael Mimitzrayim, and the bones of Joseph that they brought up from Mitzrayim, Kovru b'Shchem. They buried it in Shchem. B'chelkas hasod ha'shana kol yov me'ez b'nei chamor. And in fact, there are some scholars who say that if you look at the book of Joshua, there are so many literary allusions to the Bible that they don't call it the Pentateuch, but the Hextateuch. You can see in the Torah.com, my old professor Mark Brettler, huge Bible scholar, now a full professor, and he makes the case that that there are so many literary allusions in the Chumash that it really should be ending. The Chumash should end with Joshua 24. And here you see a framing reference at the beginning of Exodus and the end of the Exodus, which really occurred when they finally get into the land. Fine. Very nice. 3 allusions to the bones of Joseph. Let's stay on track here. What's the timeline? The timeline is as follows. Joseph dies in 1585 BC. They left Egypt 140 years later, 139 years later. So he tells them in 1585, bury me. Don't forget to take me out. 140 years later, our Pasuk, Moshe remembers and takes out the bones of Joseph. And finally buried in Canaan in 1406. So we're actually talking about 179, 180 years of carrying the bones of Joseph. Interesting. Interesting. Okay. So the question the Midrash has is as follows. The Midrash has the following problems. The first Midrash I want to quote you is from Shmos Rabbah, straight out of our text. Umoshe hoya asuk ba'atzmos Yosef. The Midrash is also bothered. Why didn't he children? His children should have been bothered about taking him out. What's Moshe getting involved in taking out the bones? Shenema vayikach Moshe es atzmos. It's Moses that's taking out the bones. Omar HaKadosh Baruch Hu Moshe. Now, we're not told why. We're told the reward. It's a big problem. We're told the reward for doing it. Hashem says to Moshe, Yosef hoyachayev la'aviv l'kovra mipnei shehu b'no. Look, I understand. Joseph had a mitzvah to bury. You know, there's a halachic mitzvah of the children to bury the parents. An obligation to his father to bury him because he was his son. Va'atar, hey, lo beno, v'lo ben beno, v'lo hoyisachayev lasok. You're not his son. You're not his grandson. You're not mechuyev to bury him. V'kovarta, and nevertheless, you are running around Egypt looking for where he's buried. You can't find him and you're running around. Everyone else is busy with their gold, the rechush gadol. They're packing their donkeys, 18 donkeys each, full of gold. And you're running around. Yosef, Yosef, where are you? For kavarta also, and you buried him nonetheless. Well, he didn't, but he never made it into the land of Israel. But they buried him. V'chein ani, and so your reward is she'eni chayev libria. I'm not responsible to bury human beings. I'm God. It's an amazing medrash. I don't have any responsibility. But guess what? Because of what you did for him, ani metapel b'cha ve'ekbaracha. I will bury you, as it says right in V'zos HaBracha, the last 8 verses of Chumash. Vayikbar oso bagai, and he buried him in Gai, in the depression in the mountain. Who buried him? God buried him. That's the reward. Uminayin hoya Moshe yodeya heichon hoya Yosef. Now, how did Moshe know where he was buried? So there are some that say, and I can show you up here, the Medrash claims, this is Perek Rabbi Yeshayahu, this is not Medrash Rabbah. When Moses entered the royal catacombs, which I guess we could say are the pyramids, he smelled Joseph's coffin. Kiven shenichnas Moshe lepalterin shel malachim, the palace of kings, Hoya mariach arono shel Yosef kareach aron habris. Here we have, for the first time, the intimation that there is the same word used for the coffin as for the aron of the Brit, of the tablets. He smelled the reach of arono shel Yosef, and how did he recognize the smell of Joseph's coffin? Because it smelled identical to the Aron Brit. The smell, there was a reach of Gan Eden from the tablets that were in the Aron HaBrit. V'omar. And so he made a calculation. B'vadai ilu atzmus shel Yosef. It's a dazzling medrash. He hot geschmeckt. There are 1,000 pyramids. There are 1,000 tombs of the pharaohs. And how do you detect it? He didn't have a sniffing dog. He was the sniffing dog. He sniffed the reach of the Aron of the Brit. Others say that he was buried like a king in a malachim shekvurim, in a royal mausoleum. V'osu Mitzrayim. Now the Egyptians knew that the Jews will want to take him as a deity. So what did they do? True to Egyptian style, and you can see this outside the tombs of the kings in Egypt, they constructed klavim shel zahav, bikshafim. They constructed dogs made of gold, which by means of magic, im yavo odom l'sham yiyu novchim. They barked, and the barking dogs, and there are barking dogs that would bark so loudly that the whole of the Mitzrayim would know, hey, the Jews are trying to find him, and they would stop them. The sounds of the barking dog. However, when Moshe came, the Midrash continues, Lo yelech kalabo loshon, the dogs, when the Jews went out of Mitzrayim, there was a miracle. They didn't bark when the Jews went out. So too here, they didn't bark when he came to the mausoleum. Now, the most common and consistent place the Medrash locates Yosef's tomb is at the bottom of the Nile River. The Egyptians made Aron shel matekes. This was a metal coffin that would not float in water, unlike the ones we see in the British Museum that are all made of wood. V'kavu b'nilus hanahar. Interestingly, they fixed it in the river Nile, kadei sheyitbaruchu miyomov. The Gemara in Sota says something very interesting. They wanted the blessing of Joseph to inherit after his death. And so the Gemara in Sota 13, this has this wonderful agadah that he was buried in the Nile River because they wanted the Nile River, which was the god of Egypt, to contain the bones of Joseph, who was the savior, the Mashbir of Egypt. They wanted that to continue after his death. So how did Moshe know where Joseph was buried? Here we come to the famous Midrash that Moshe met up with Sarach. Now Sarach, this is, we're talking about 140 years later. She's still alive. She remained from that generation. She is this old hag that remains. She is this intimation of memory. She, remember, came down to Egypt with Yaakov Avinu, and Moshe went to her and said, do you know anything about where Joseph is buried? And she says to him, yeah, yeah, the Egyptians fashioned a metal casket for him and put it in the Nile River so that the water would be blessed. So he now goes to the bank of the Nile River. And now we have this conversation. He addresses Joseph, Yosef, Yosef, Higia Hazman. This is the time has arrived about which the Kadosh Baruch Hu took an oath, Pakod, that same oath, the fulfillment of the oath that you adjured the Jewish people, Pakod Tifgad. God will remember, and I want you, same words, you to remember me. If you show yourself, it's good, and if not, then we are patur from the oath. And immediately the casket of Joseph floated to the top of the water. Now, I have to share with you an extra biblical text called the Tibat Marker text, which was brought to light by the biblical scholar Leila Bronner. And she describes in this text how the Israelites are unable to move on their journey from Ramses to Sukkot because they were blocked by a pillar of fire. And Moshe and the elders confer with various tribal leaders to determine what have we done wrong. And when visiting the area of the tribe of Asher, they saw the old hag, Sarach ben Asher, still alive. With clairvoyant vision, she informs them that no evil has been committed. The problem is simply, you forgot Joseph's bones. That's why the pillar of fire will not let you go. And so what happens? She says, I will reveal to you what the secret is. And they brought her to the great prophet Moses and said, praise those who remembered my bed Joseph, those you have forgotten him. For had not the pillar of cloud and the pillar of fire stood still, you would have departed and left Egypt without him. I remember the day that he died and caused the whole people to swear, Pakod Yifkad, that they would bring his bones up from here. Worthy are you, says Moshe, wisest of women. From this day on your greatness will be told. And so they went after them until she came to the place where he was hidden. It's an amazing embellishing of the Midrash. And from the sense of these Midrashim, we get the idea that the Atzmos Yosef is not just some kind of afterthought for the Israelites on their 40 years of wandering. In fact, like the Ark of Covenant, it accompanied them. And I have to show you this ancient Mechilta. The ancient Mechilta, which it says, V'hoyu ovrim v'shavim ma tivan shnei aronos halalu. They were in the wilderness, and there are now two arons. One contains the bones of Joseph, and the other one contains the Aron Habrit. So, what is this? And here the Medrash says, Ma tivan shel shnei aronos halalu. Heim omrim, and the Israelites have said, what is going on? Ze arona shel meis, v'ze arona shel chai olamim. In one is contained the bones of a dead man, the bones of Joseph, the Atzmos Yosef. V'ze arona shel chai olamim, and this is the Ark of the Covenant that contains the bris, the tablets of the living God. V'omrim lahem. Mativu shel meis la'alon me'aron achai. What are you mixing up the dead and the living? The living of living, the life of all life. Chai olamim. God who produces life next to a dead man. And then va'omrim lahem. Mechilta said, Hamunach ba'aron zeh kiye ma shekosuv b'munach ba'aron hazeh. A stunning medrash. The one who's lying dead in this aron, the bones of Joseph, was Mekayim, what it says, Munach ba'aron zeh. Joseph, the bones of Joseph are brought in the same aron, next to the Aron Brit Hashem, as a lesson of instruction that his bones may be dead, but the body that inhabited those bones, the personality that rests in that Aron, fulfilled everything that is in this Aron, which is the law of life. B'munach ba'aron zeh, Anochi Hashem Elokecha. I am the Lord your God, the Decalogue. U'b'Yosef, Hatachtem Elohim Anochi. The proof text they use to show one fulfilling the other is the first introduction of God in the Decalogue. I am the Lord your God. This is who I am. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Mitzrayim. And the proof text to show that Joseph fulfilled everything, the one thing, we have 100 verses in Genesis of his speech, is, am I a substitute for God? Do you think that I am God? Do you think that I can take, in Bereshit chapter 50, when the brothers get scared, you think I'm not God? I have no control over life and death. And he goes through every one of the 10 commandments, showing how Yosef, in his words, fulfilled what was in those words. Absolutely stunning midrash. Now, when Joshua gets over to the River Jordan, the newly inaugurated Israelite leader is fully engaged in military and political affairs. And only upon his death, at the end of the book of Joshua, do those elders who survive him make arrangements for the final interment of Joseph's bones. And why is Shechem the site of the burial, asks the Midrash, according to Exodus Rabbah. Very dark interpretation, my friends. Mishchem ganvu achiv shel Yosef. He's buried in Shechem because that's where his journey started. From being just a nice kid frolicking in the field as the favorite of his father Jacob, where they ganved him, they took him and threw him in the pit. Mishchem ganvu achiv shel Yosef oto, umachru oto, and sold him. Ukeshebali pater min ha'olam, and when it was time for him, Hishbia otam bevakasha mikem achai mishchem ganavtem oti chai hechzir etz atzmosai l'shchem. The medrash is filling up, not pakod yifkod eschem. That's God will remember you. I want you to pakod, to fulfill a debt to me. You stole me in Shechem. Please remember, when you come to Eretz Yisrael, take my bones through the wilderness and through the conquest of Canaan. And when you finally settle down, remember and bury me in the same place where you geganved me, where you stole me. It's a kind of poetic license, poetic justice, a payback. Lekach nema ve'etz asmos Yosef. That's why it says in the pasuk at the end of Joshua, the bones of Joseph. Why do you have to remind me of the bones? Just say Joseph. They buried Joseph. No, the Atzmos Yosef remind them of what he did for his father Jacob. He buried him, the Atzmos, and his Atzmos were buried. This is all a midrashic play and a hint. Joseph's bones, the Atzmos Yosef, remained with them throughout their sojourn in the wilderness. The midrash then, before we leave the midrash, is doing what? It clarifies the contradictions in the biblical text, the redundancies of the word atzmos, and seeks to provide answers to confusing or unknown dimensions of our Torah. So with regard to Joseph's bones, midrashic tradition elaborates on the biblical material, addressing the two central questions. Where exactly were the bones of Joseph? And how was Moses able to find them where Joseph's coffin had been placed? Those bones remained with them throughout their travels. And they remind us of an age-old Jewish truth, that between the world of the living and the world of the dead, there is no wall, there is just a window. Remembering the Atzmos Yosef as our biblical midrashic ancestors did, we remember to open that window and carry within our hearts the connections to loved ones who have entered the world beyond, so that our lives may be filled with guidance, inspiration, and blessings. Now, let's just dive a little bit deeper into the Zohar. And the Zohar tells us that the Zohar is bothered. The Zohar is bothered by the fact that he's put in the Nile River. And so the Zohar says as follows. Joseph's coffin was cast into the water. Now you're telling me the Nilus River. Isn't the Nilus River the god of Egypt? Why would you put him into the Nilus River? And the Zohar says, Oif hocha Yosef b'maya itrame arona delay. Joseph's coffin was cast into the water. Omar HaKadosh Baruch Hu. I Yosef yistalech mihacha galuta lo yitkayem. The Zohar says something absolutely stunning. It says that if Joseph departs from here, the exile will remain unfulfilled. Elo, tehei kvuroso ba'atar de lo yisaib. Let him burial be not in a place that can be defiled, like a mausoleum or in the ground or in a tomb. That can be defiled. But I need it to be in a place that it cannot be defiled. The Yizbalum b'nei Israel galuta, so that Israel will endure the exile. What is this midrashic statement? Obviously, it's medrash because it's nothing to do with the pshat. If Joseph departs from here, the exile will remain unfulfilled. Meaning that he needs to be around for them to get out. And however, my problem is we can't defile him, because if it's defiled, then the exile will remain unfulfilled. If he's invulnerable to the impurity of Egypt, then the Shekhinah could manifest near him, alleviating Israel's suffering. If Joseph had been buried outside of Egypt, the Shekhinah would have been deprived of her human base. Yosef is the Merkava, the chariot for the Shekhinah. Wherever he goes, she goes. And the Am Yisrael, Onochi im Chobatzoro, the Shekhinah gives us the ability to endure the exile. Which had to be completed, to be fulfilled, before we could be redeemed and brought to the promised land. There's this notion that you have to fulfill and the redeeming can only happen once the number of years that I promised Abraham would have been fulfilled. So the Shekhinah in this amazing Zohar is placed with Yosef, waiting for the deliverance, and the Nile, paradoxically, the Nile is the river god, right? Paradoxically, becomes the place where he can be protected from being defiled. And let's now move a little bit deeper and try to make sense for ourselves. What does these midrashic traditions mean from a mythic perspective? How does this relate to us? The bones of Joseph. What does Joseph mean? Why is Moshe specifically the one who is burying the bones of Joseph? And so we have to recall elements of the Joseph story in its entirety. Joseph is the dreamer. He's gifted with important prophetical, archetypal dreams and skilled interpreting the dreams. So if we could be permitted to use the language of Jungian psychology, which I find very close to Kabbalah, we can say that Joseph is in touch, and we are now appropriating the story of Joseph. That is, we ourselves have within us a Joseph and a Moshe and a skeletal bone structure. What do these mean? We could say that Joseph is in touch with the depths of the unconscious psyche, the self, the inner divine, the Chelek Elokai Mimal, Mamash. Remember, we have within us the 10 Sefirot. Keser, Chochmah, Bina is the Chabad. Netzach, Chesed, Gvur, Tferes is our emotionalities. And Netzach, Hod, Yesod are the generative process. The Yesod is that which passes into Malchut. Yosef is the Yesod. And so if we could appropriate that language, that Kabbalistic language, for our inner psychic development, then Yosef is in touch because he's a dreamer, because he interprets the unconscious sleep cycles of the mind. He's in touch with the depths of the unconscious psyche, the self, and the inner divine. And as the great interpreter of Jung, Edward Edinger, writes, that the emergence of Pharaoh who knew not Joseph, Asher lo yoda es Yosef, this new Pharaoh, represents the psychological condition in which the conscious self has been eclipsed and forgotten. This creates a psychological, spiritual state of slavery. So the definition of slavery is when I am not in touch with the depths of my unconscious self. I am divorced from it. I'm stuck in my ego self-awareness. This creates the spiritual state of internal bondage to the demands of the ego, the addict, the narrow, limited places of Mitzrayim, the Meitzah, the narrow spaces. Now comes Joseph's death, and the wisdom of the deep psyche goes back into the unconscious. Remember, death in the Kabbalah is just, as Rab Nachman says, changing one pair of garments for another. It's a window into the afterlife. It's not a separation. So death is just a different altered state of my psychic being. And therefore my dying is just a different level of the Arba Partsufim, Olam HaBriya, Yetzira, Atzilus, Briya, Yetzira, and Asir. So when the Asir leaves, there's a death of the Asir, you move into the next one up. And it goes into the unconscious, beneath the waters of the Nile. And even there the Zohar teaches us the Shekhinah is present, albeit hidden away. The image of the Atzmos Yosef, the bones of Joseph, hidden beneath the waters of the Nile, represents the wisdom depths of the psyche. Surrounded and bathing in the Shekhinah, this wisdom is hidden, but not extinguished, accessible with the right awareness. And who brings us to this awareness? The ancient, old, surviving hag, Sarah Bas Asher, who helps Moshe, the ego, find the Atzmos Yosef hidden beneath the waters of the Nile. Mythically, she is the spirit guide to the depths of the unconscious. In classical Jungian terms, she represents the anima, the internal feminine principle which brings one in contact with the deeper, higher, sacred self. And so with the ending of the period of Egyptian slavery and the emergence into freedom, the ego oppression of the self, the wisdom of the depths, symbolized by Joseph's bones, is once again prepared to emerge. Through the guidance of Sarah Bas Asher and the skillful means of Moshe's magical practices, dropping into the Nile a golden tablet engraved with the tetragrammaton, which we didn't talk about, or the pieces of Joseph's goblet with the engraved images, the wisdom of the depth arises, becoming conscious again. And so in leaving behind slavery and the oppression of the ego, the Israelites are now reawakened into consciousness, passing through, I love this expression, the birth canal of the Red Sea. As the sea splits, they're coming through the waters of the womb of the sea of unconsciousness and emerging into a new consciousness. And throughout the trials and travails of the wandering through Sinai, and remember there are 42 stations in the Midbar, and the Maggid of Mezrich tells us that each Yid, every Yid, goes through 42 trials in his life till he gets to this promised land. Transported alongside the Ark of the Covenant, the Aron HaBrit, the central symbol of God's manifestation, the light of all light, the surrounding light, the transcendent light, is the Aron of the Atzmos Yosef. This dehydrated, decomposed, right there, the absolute opposite of life, which you might think was death, comes along. No, the Shekhinah is right there next to him in the Aron. The wisdom of the souls in the world beyond. And so that brings us to the understanding that his Atzmos Yosef, represent an unbroken connection between the world of the living and the world of the dead. Joseph's bones remind us of an age-old Jewish truth that between the world of the living and the world of the dead, there is but a window. And remembering the Atzmos Yosef, we remember to open that window and carry in our hearts the connections that we have with our loved ones, as I am now coming up to the 3rd anniversary of my beloved departed mother. I want to end with an intimation of everything I just said that you might think, well, it's just Jung. Let's end up with Rabbi Nachman. Rabbi Nachman says that Moshe isn't Moshe and Yosef isn't Yosef. Each of these are archetypes that are within us. And so what is our spiritual approach? You know, modern psychoanalytical theory, Freudian theory, not Jungian theory, teaches us that the fictions of closure are linked to the death drive, the end of making love, le petit mort, the end of one's physical life. There is a death drive that as the end of desire, once you have fulfilled desire, the fulfillment is tantamount to death. Desire itself, however, and this is real Ishbitz Torah, the perpetual desire, that is the divine. Only the divine has this desire. When he desired to create the world, that now holographically infects the world with that divine desire, everything in it. And that perpetual desire ensures a sense of the textuality. What we're doing in the Midrashic and Jungian and Nachmanian readings of the text are to tease out the desire behind the texts. In our parlance, scriptuality. Textuality becomes scriptuality. The Bible complicates this picture because it gives us at once the desire. The promised land is, after all, pakod yifkod. I have been promised that. Abraham has been promised that. Could you please fulfill the promise? And a sense of nostalgia as we now live in an exile. Biblical repetition then suggests, remember, Genesis, Exodus, and Joshua, Atzmos Yosef, Atzmos Yosef, Atzmos Yosef, suggests at once discontinuity and continuity. Discontinuity because there must be a break to enable something to be repeated, just as something must be lost to be recovered, forgotten to be remembered. And continuity because the fact of repetition, recovery, memory ensures a living on. In this sense, the idea of death and resurrection is not so alien to the Hebrew Bible as it is terribly familiar. There are many dyings and risings rather than some single resurrection. Thus, there are more bones. In Ezekiel, the bones of the army of Israel come to life. Jacob's bones are buried in the Machpelah, and Joseph's lie in Canaan, but no one knows where the bones of Moshe Rabbeinu lie. For a typologist, those missing bones are very critical to our reading. The absent bones of Moshe, suggesting the possibility of an ascension, the absent grave, a testimony that Moses is type of a resurrected being, and the missing bones of Moshe points to an infinite Moshe and suggests that we, like Moshe, will never reach the promised land of a definitive truth. And I love that reading by Regina Schwartz. The promised land of a definitive truth is always outside our grasp. So let me finish with Rabbeinu. Having said that, we now come to a different understanding of the Moshe within us and the Yosef within us. True to the Kabbalistic style, I efshar lavo lemochin zakim, you cannot come to that refined awareness of the deepest part of yourselves, elo al yedei hiskashrus letzadikim. That's the claim Reb Nachman is making. What does that mean? It doesn't mean I mean, in one sense, it means you go to Uman on Rosh Hashanah to be miskasher to the tzaddik, but his bones are lying in Uman. They're just bones. What does he really mean? That is a metaphor for what we have to do in our lives to recover the bones of our Josephs, the traumas that have been buried in our deep unconsciousness, the skeletons in the closet, to use a very literal metaphor. We all have skeletons in the closet. And then Rabbeinu brings the Zohar that we learned. Vayikach Moshe es atzmus Yosef. So Moshe isn't Moshe and Yosef isn't Yosef, but the bones remain the bones. It's the same typology. Moshe bechinas mochin. Efshar lavo lemochin. I cannot come to that Moses awareness, that tiferes within me, zakin, in a refined way, without any ego contamination. Elo al yedei yiskashus l'tzadikim. Yosef hu bechinas tzadik. Yosef is the tzadik because he's the yesod, because he connects tiferes, which is Moshe, which is ego consciousness, with Shekhinah. Remember, it's a straight line from Keser, Das, Tiferes, Yesod, Malchus. That's the straight line of the Sephirotic tree without any of the embellishments on either side. Yosef is the Chinas Tzaddik, She'ein Shleimus Lemochin. There is no perfection of my ego consciousness, my Moses consciousness, my consciousness of my inner desire. Elo al yedei iskashrus letzadikim. Why? I need to connect to the tzadikim in my generation, because they should be opening me to this, to my spirit guides, the Sarah ben Asher, who shows us where the Nile is and where the bones are buried, the skeletons in the closet, through the hiskashrus to the tzaddik of myself, through my own dreams, and my wishes and my desire. Tapping into that allows me the behirus, this clarity of Mochin Zakin. No, we've gone through a long journey about bones, and I'm going to post Jim's comments because he had some ideas yesterday that I'll post online tomorrow. Thank you, everybody. May you all experience the skeletons in your closet, and may you all be zoicha to a spirit guide that opens you up to the deep, darkest secrets of your desire, that makes you b'shleimut, an integrated, as Jung call it, the integrated personality.